Welcome, I'm Nina Griffin and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. Today we'll talk about astrological talismans of the planetary type. First off, I wanted to say thank you to all of my patrons. I appreciate all of your support and encouragement. If you would like to join my Patreon, you can get access to astrological magical content earlier than everyone else, and in many cases it's often available only to patrons. Also, on a monthly basis at the highest tier, you can get access to my guide to planetary and other magical talismans, the best time to make your celestial talismans called magical elections. You can get that at patreon.com/Nina Griffin. Planetary talismans are probably the bread and butter of astrological magic. There are other types of talismans and we will address them in future videos, but planetary talismans are probably the most obvious, the most basic, and in many cases often the most versatile of astrological magical talismans that you can make. The concept is pretty simple. All it means is that you need to wait for a moment when your chosen planet is going to be very strong by sign, and it's going to be in a prominent place in the sky, and at that moment you're going to create your talisman. Obviously there might be a window, so you'll notice, for example, in my monthly magical elections, you'll notice there is a window of 20 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever that captures that period, usually quite short, for when that planet is both powerful by sign and by placement. However, that is not the end of the story. And in fact, this is the place where I would say the beginner astrological magical trainees are separated from the more advanced students, because as it turns out, the success of your talisman is not only determined by what's going on with your so-called, what I call focal planet. So let's say that your talisman is about Venus. Well, it's fine to have her exalted and conjunct the ascendant or whatever other configuration you want, but what's the rest of the chart doing? Because of course, as you know, there are other planets in the sky, and unless they are also harmoniously aligned, or at least aligned in a way that's not working against your main goal, you might not have a very effective talisman, even if your focal planet is very strong. And this is a lesson that I learned many years ago when I was starting out with astrological magic. I really wanted a Jupiter talisman, but at the time, Jupiter was only in the sign of its triplicity. And this, of course, is going to be a long wait because, as you know, Jupiter goes through just one sign a year, so it might take a few years for it to get into a sign where it's very, very powerful, like the sign of its domicile or the sign of its exaltation. So what ended up happening is I had this Jupiter in triplicity talisman that looked great and it did absolutely nothing. And so this was one of my first earliest lessons in, no, you really need to have the planet in question be in major dignity, which again means its own sign or the sign of its exaltation. But as I always tell my students in the class that I teach on magical elections, don't take my word for it, try it for yourself. I don't think it's necessarily harmful, but just know that planets are not really going to work for you very dramatically or often at all, unless the planet is in a sign where it, a sign that it owns or a sign of its exaltation. There are other factors that you need to worry about with all kinds of magical elections charts. Certainly, we need to always think about the moon and what she is doing or about to do. And we need to think about other planets that could be potentially working again against the goal that you have, right? So let's say that you've got your Venus in Pisces on the ascendant and you want to make a talisman for romance and attractiveness or something like that. Well, if Mars is squaring Venus from the midheaven, you're probably not going to have a very successful talisman, or at the very least you will get what you wanted, but with a strong Mars caveat attached to it. Very often people find that these talismans, because they're just such a raw delivery of planetary energy, if talismans go wrong, meaning they were constructed during a less than optimal astrological time, people often find that it's easier and better to just destroy the talisman and start over again at a more auspicious time. It's my personal opinion that if you are a student of astrological magic, you are going to do much, much better if you make a few mistakes along the way. But at the same time, recognize that it's not a personal failing. You just need to acknowledge, yes, I made a talisman that caused maybe something negative to occur, and then you just destroy the talisman. But to get back to our main topic, it's planetary talismans that are kind of the main, again, bread and butter of the astrological magician's toolbox. Now, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily the most powerful, right? Using the analogy of tools, it's really about having the right tool for the job, right? So planetary talismans are fine for certain things, for the things that the planets rule, but I've also gotten great results, and so have many others, from fixed star talismans, for example. And then there are also Decan talismans, and not to forget our friends, the lunar mansion talismans. So there are many different categories of talismans, and be aware that planets are probably the most, I would say, versatile, right? Because in the traditional scheme, we have 7 visible classical planets, right? The planets that are visible to the naked eye. And this is another reason why I always recommend for people to, at least when they're getting started, to work primarily with the classical planets. Not only do they map to the days of the week and the planetary hours, in which modern planets have no place, but the classical planets, because they are visible to the eye, they have a very special connection to the human being and to our human earthly plane. It's very important for us to be able to see the talisman if you were making a physical talisman, and to have that visual connection to the celestial entity that we are working with. There is something a little bit more abstract, a little bit more remote about outer planets, since of course they can only be seen with magnification and with telescopes. Now, fixed stars are interesting. We'll talk about them separately because they usually can be seen with the naked eye unless you're working with some very, very obscure ones. However, they operate a little bit differently than the planets, and that's a whole different discussion topic. For the planets, though, the main thing to remember, especially if you're just starting out, is to be very good and very precise and to do your research about what the different planets rule. I always recommend to everyone, and in fact I require it of my students, to get a copy of Dr. Lee Lehman's The Rulership Book. And what this book has, it's basically a very well-sourced, from traditional sources, list of the different things, objects, concepts, experiences that are associated with each planet. And unlike some other rulership books out there, this book ties each of these to the particular traditional source. So what this also does is that if there's ever any division, and there often is about, for example, what planet rules roses, well, you can see, for example, that there are maybe 3 sources that think it's Venus, and maybe there's one source who thinks it's Mars. And so you have to make a decision, of course, which is which, but at the same time, it's very positive because you can see where there's that preponderance of opinion. You know, do most authors think that it's ruled by Venus versus Mars, just as an example. So this is a very helpful book to have because I know that a lot of people, especially when they're starting in astrological magic, they may or may not have had a really great astrological education. It doesn't mean that they're bad astrologers, but it does mean that in a lot of especially modern astrological schools or schools of thought, there is not as much emphasis placed on astrological symbolism, especially where it relates to concrete things. You know, in modern astrology, especially sort of psychological astrology, the planets are connected to concepts or to feelings or to maybe sort of very abstract experiences. However, as magical astrologers or astrological magicians, we have to think about these planets in very concrete ways, about the things that they rule and the kinds of, for example, objects that you would need to bring to your ritual, as well as the kinds of problems that they might rule or cause or solve, right? So in other words, if you're having problems attracting people and you want to go on a lot of dates, do you deal with Saturn? Do you deal with Venus? And why? And this is kind of an obvious one. Most people, I think, would say Venus, but at the same time, there are a lot of concerns that people have where they get very confused and are very unclear about what planet they should be working with. Usually the answer is fairly straightforward, but again, unless you have that background or unless you have a really good source like the Book of Rulerships, it can be a little difficult to figure out what planet you should even be working with. Of course, you're not going to get the best possible result if you're dialing the wrong planetary number, as it were. All right, thanks for watching. We'll cover other topics in the future. I'd like to talk about the other types of talismans that I mentioned today. In the meantime, you can find out more on my Patreon. Thanks for watching. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel.